Good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome to our event, Bridging Science and Policy, Plastics and One Health in Agri-Food Systems. A warm welcome to everyone joining us online and those here in the room. We're delighted to have you with us. My name is Giulia Carcasci. I am an agricultural plastic specialist here at FAO, and I will moderate this session for the next hour. After that, we will have a short coffee break, and then we'll reconvene for the second part of today's session. This webinar is part of the workshop Plastics and One Health in Agri-Food Systems, Understanding and Managing Risks, which FAO is co-organizing with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and with Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore. We had a rich discussion yesterday and today on the linkages between plastics and microplastics with animal, environment, and human health. The goal of this afternoon session is to explore how scientific evidence on plastic pollution in agri-food systems connects to One Health principles and can inform policy decisions. For those joining online, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A chat. Time permitting, we will take some questions from the chat. For those in the room, you can raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. To start, I am pleased to invite Tanawa Tiensin, FAO Director of the Animal Production and Health Division and FAO Chief Veterinarian, for the opening remarks.
Be informal. Yesterday we talked already during the reception, and that's why I know immediately half of the participants maybe busy something else. No, you're still all here. But it's just only some colleagues also join virtually. And this one is open for how many participants? 200. Okay, now I have to be formal. Actually, I thought that it's just only some of you here. And that's why, okay, thank you very much for joining us at FAO today. And as my colleagues already mentioned, when you're talking about One Health in agri-food system, before, when we're talking about One Health, it's just only One Health for pandemic prevention, One Health for zoonosis, One Health for COVID-19, that bring all our multidisciplinary come together to work as a team to address the complex issues. And that's why regarding the plastic, the issue itself is also very complex by itself. And that's why in this case, to make sure that the issue of plastic that we are discussing, we also can use the One Health approach to address these issues. The plastic and agricultures, usually, most of people didn't think about it. It seemed to be far away. When you're talking about plastic, people would think just only maybe shopping bag, plastic bag, when we go shopping. But as I discussed with you yesterday, today our farmers use plastic to improve their productions, whatever, plant production, crop productions, aquaculture, fisheries, animal productions, and others. And that's why the impact of use plastic in agriculture, it really will link to our health. Even though it's not only about talking about microplastic, even though the plastic itself, how we're going to deal with after use of the plastic, because sometimes we just have only single use of plastic. And that's why how we're going to manage after the use of plastic for the productions. And we know that the impact of plastic and microplastic is also linked to our health. When the microplastic in waters, ocean, in soil. And that's why you have heard so many scientific papers. Now we detect microplastic in fish, in others agricultural products. And that's why I think these issues is very, very critical. And especially last 2 or 3 weeks, I attended the One Sustainable Health Forum in Lyon at the International Agencies for Research on Cancer. And as we discussed yesterday, the food that we are eating, the place that we are living, it linked to our health. If our place that we are living have a lot of pollution, air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, will have an impact to our health outcome, human health, animal health, plant health, ecosystem health. And as I mentioned yesterday as well, the number of deaths from unsafe food each year is around 8 million people, even though higher than zoonotic diseases combined together. And one of the issue as well, if we want to reduce the incidence, for example, when I mentioned about cancer, the incidence of cancers, we need to improve the environment that we are living. We need to improve our food to make sure it's a safe food, nutritious food, and healthy food. And that's why at FAO, now we are working on One Health in agri-food system. It's not only One Health for pandemic prevention or pandemics only, but how the One Health linked to soil health, linked to plant health, linked to ecosystem health, linked to animal health, aquatic animal health, wildlife health, and others. Because in FAO, we can say that the organization is by the nature of the organization with many experts who are working in different areas, like my friend who are working from the divisions of food safety. If we don't have safe food, we will have impact to our health. I have some colleagues who are working on maybe from fishery or aquaculture. If we have the overuse and misuse of antibiotics in aquaculture, it will have an impact to our health. And overuse of antibiotics will have a residues in the products. And at the end, the residue will have an impact to our health as well. Overuse and misuse of pesticide chemical in plant production will have an impact to soil and water. And then at the end, will have an impact to our health, animal health, and others. And that's why today you come here with the very clear goals, how we're going to move forward to raise awareness. But only raise awareness. It just only raise awareness. If you don't take really action, how are we going to encourage our farmers, policy makers, producers, if we really want to make sure that management, sustainable management of use of plastic in agriculture or in agri-food system, how are we going to make sure that after the meeting today, you will have the guideline or you will have the policies, guidance to the countries, but at the end to make sure that farmers, producers, private sectors, the one who really working in the field really take action. And the government also would like to use the policy guidance that FAO together with all of you we are producing to be part of their national policy and translate into action on ground. Because otherwise, our work, our talk today will have no action. And that's why today, thank you again for inviting me to talk with all of you and to make sure that the One Health is not only the concept. Everyone, everywhere, they talk, you can see today, every meeting, One Health. Every meeting, One Health. But how One Health is really linked to the real expertise. It comes from willingness of all of us who are working together. how environmentalists would like to work with agriculturalists, how agriculturalists can work with veterinarians, how veterinarian can work with the public health workers. And that's why everyone can bring your good practices. Sometimes you also can bring your resource, because the Ministry of Agriculture have less resource, but Ministry of Public Health maybe have more. Even though the private sectors, they also can take some action. And you can see very well when some country ban or reduce the use of plastic bag in supermarket. This one is also, we can say, is a One Health approach. It comes from the clear policy from the government and need action by private sectors, the owner of supermarket, and also need real support from all consumers. And that's why it's always the beauty of One Health, I'm sure, that can bring us together and can deal with the issues of plastic in agriculture, and we will see result together and have a better future together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tanavat, for already highlighting some of the linkages that really defines the questions around microplastics and nanoplastic pollutions in agri-food systems. And I think that connects us very nicely to our next presentation. And I would like to introduce Professor Richard Thompson, Director of the University of Plymouth's Marine Institute, who will share key findings on microplastic pollution and its impacts on agri-food systems. The floor is yours, Richard, and I will share the screen in just a second.
Is it maximized? Yeah. All right. Brilliant. Okay. Well, oops, go back. Thank you very much, everybody. Delighted to be here. Thank you for the kind invitation to present at the FAO and to colleagues online. I want to talk to you a bit about microplastics in agri-food systems. And I come to this as a marine biologist, but as you'll see, a marine biologist with some experience in microplastics. More than 20 years ago, we wrote the first scientific paper using the term microplastics to describe the long-term accumulation of small fragments of plastic in the environment. Last year, we wrote a review summarizing the now 6,000 scientific papers providing evidence around the sources, fate, and impacts of microplastic. And I can supply copies of that to anyone that's interested. And that includes both marine and terrestrial realms. Key points I want to make before I get into the detail of the talk. First of all, that whilst we're focusing here on microplastics, plastic pollution occurs across a wide range of different sizes. Microplastics do not suddenly become harmful or more or less harmful because they're within a particular size category. We're dealing here with plastic pollution across the planet from some items that are literally so large we can see them from satellites in space, through contamination of everyday items of bottles and packaging, into the microplastics now defined as particles less than 5 millimeters in many policy circles, down to 1 micron. And below that, most scientists in the field believe there will be nanoparticles accumulating in even greater quantities. But we're dealing with a size continuum. So whilst I'm talking here about microplastics, let's not imagine that they are something special. They are part of a size continuum that certainly has the potential to cause considerable harm. The second point I want to make is that while I came to this as a marine biologist, the pictures on the right-hand side are those that I presented to policymakers in the EU relating to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive more than a decade ago. Those examples were all focused on the marine environment because that's where the attention at the time was, of course, for the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. It is now undeniable that plastic pollution occurs across the entire life cycle of plastics, from material extraction through use to disposal, whether that's items of litter, of solid items of plastic, or the associated chemicals. So the only way to address it is to take a systems approach that encompasses the full life cycle. We can't address this simply by waste management. We need to address the full life cycle. Focusing on microplastics, the evidence is really clear that they are accumulating across our planet, literally from the poles to the equators. From our deepest oceans to our highest mountains, we now find microplastics. Food and agricultural systems, soils, aquaculture, fisheries are all equally affected by that contamination. If we turn to the main sources of microplastics, some of them you could say are distant from agriculture and fisheries. We've got tire wear particles, paints, synthetic textiles, but the largest source of all is actually the fragmentation of larger items. Many of those items, those larger items, are used in the agriculture and fisheries sector, and indeed some pieces of plastic that are already of microplastic size are used for delivery, for example, of fertilizers in the system. So I'm going to unpack some of that blue bar in some of the remaining examples, but also let's not forget that the food system is affected by contamination arising indirectly from those other sources, the tires, the textiles, the paint. Here is one example of microplastic accumulation in the agricultural system. These are different mulching films, conventional polyethylene at the bottom, and some described as being more biodegradable above it. We've exposed those in soil plus a pre-treatment to the air, and also in seawater and in air alone. And what you see after 2 years is that in most cases, we've still got intact films. The only place where we're seeing a substantial degradation is actually in seawater, which is, I stress and probably don't need to stress to you, not the context in which agricultural mulch films are actually used. So what we're seeing here is either persistence of a solid film after 2 years or persistence of microplastic particles. So in systems where we're applying these annually, what we will get is long-term accumulation of fragments of plastic or large solid films. But same story if we turn to fisheries. Here, when a single rope is hauled in recovering a net or a lobster pot, we're seeing literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of microplastic fibers released to the environment. It's also clear then, that those fibers and microplastics that are released are also accumulating. This evidence, and this slide is from laboratory experiments where we exposed edible foods. On the left, mussels, mulfrit, if you're familiar with those, and on the right, scallops taken from the seabed near to my university in Plymouth. What these slides show is that within a few hours of exposure to micro and nanoplastics, we've got accumulation across that entire scallop, across all of its tissues. Then if we continually move it to clean conditions, I stress clean conditions are no longer a possibility in the natural environment. The natural environment is contaminated everywhere with micro and nanoplastics. But if we move those scallops continually to clean conditions, even after 8 days, we've got retention in some tissues, the hepatopancreas, analogous to the liver in humans. And even a month later, we're still detecting retention of some of those nanoparticles. So we've got clear evidence from lab studies of uptake and indeed accumulation in particular organs. Similar study published recently showing the same principles for plant crops in the edible parts of radishes here. Looking at this more widely, what we're seeing across all of the evidence across those thousands of papers is widespread exposure to a wide range of species. And critically, the smaller particles, the micro and nano, are much more biologically available. The larger items of plastic debris can only be ingested by a large creature. The small pieces can be ingested and even inhaled by almost all of us. So microplastics are now literally in the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat. And there's predictions of large-scale irreversible effects over the next 100 years. It's clear that that exposure extends to wild-caught fish, as illustrated in this example, where over 500 fish caught from the English Channel, a third of them were contaminated with microplastics across a range of 10 species. Sorry, going backwards. Where are we now then in this debate? We've seen lots of evidence, I would say, thousands of papers published on the problem definition. Where we need to go forward is almost the bottom half of this slide. We've had an increasing supply of scientific evidence, the green triangle at the top, on the problem. That has been matched by an increasing but then diminishing demand from policymakers for evidence about the problem. Why is it decreasing? I'm saying it's decreasing because actually we've now reached consensus that plastics and microplastics are presenting a problem. And the clear evidence of that is the 170 plus nations agreeing to work together towards an international legally binding treaty to end plastic pollution. So we need to move the science from continual debate about the extent of the problem now to the what do we do about it. The evidence around upstream measures, reduction, redesign, alternatives, substitutes. This is no longer an issue of the science defining the problem. It's an issue that the science needs to help guide us towards the solutions. The problem, in my view, is undeniable. It's not plastics as materials that are the cause of the problem, and I've got plastics illustrated here in food systems as packaging, but they could equally be examples in agriculture. It's clear that plastics bring immense benefits to society. We need to keep those benefits, whether it's lightweight parts in cars and aeroplanes that reduce fuel emissions, carbon emissions, or uses in hospitals or packaging to reduce food wastage. We need to retain those benefits without the problems I've alluded to. Oops. Okay, so to give you a few examples then of how we might do that. Consider the interventions around textiles and clothing, for example. You might say, well, textiles and clothing are some way distant from food and agricultural systems. But as I work through this example, you see there's a really clear and direct link. The work we've already got shows that potentially millions of small fibers are released from clothing each time we do a domestic wash of clothing. Similar quantities are released over an annual cycle as we walk around and wear those clothes. Some wastewater treatment plants are incredibly effective at capturing those particles in the sewage sludge, in the solids. But of course, common practice in many countries is to spread those solids back onto the land as a kind of nutrient enrichment. That makes good sense in terms of circularity of the nutrients and organic material. But of course, it means that any microplastics that have been intercepted are then returned to the environment. Solutions that have been proposed include filters for washing machines and improved capacity to separate microplastics in wastewater treatment. But let's not forget that most of the world's population do not have the benefits that we do here in Europe of domestic washing machines, of advanced wastewater treatment. The research we've also done shows that there are substantial differences between different garments in terms of the rate of release, with some garments releasing up to 80% fewer fibers. This clearly points to the need for intervention at the design stage to make sure that emissions to the environment are reduced, rather than looking at downstream solutions in wastewater treatment and washing machines. Also, it's commonly speculated that a shift perhaps from conventional petrochemical-derived plastics to biodegradable plastics might solve the problem. Here we present evidence that bio-sourced materials such as viscose and lyocell fibers that could have been spread in those sewage applications I was just talking about are actually more harmful to earthworms than conventional polyester. So we need to be cautious as we think about alternatives and substitutes and not automatically damning the petrochemical-based fibers and favouring those sourced from different origins. Critically, I think the point is we need to be really clear, and we need scientific evidence that we don't have false hope, what the psychologists I work with call techno-optimism. So we need to make sure that anything that's described as a solution is properly backed by independent scientific evidence. And when I say independent, I mean that the scientists who conduct that evidence don't stand to gain or lose as a consequence of the outcomes of the science. Here we see examples of plastic carrier bags labelled as biodegradable that can still carry a full load of shopping after being in seawater for more than 3 years. In the bottom left-hand corner, we see examples of tea bags that are marketed as being biodegradable, that have merely fragmented into small pieces or remained intact after deployment for 7 months in soil. And interestingly, the parts that remain are actually some of the novel polymers described as being of benefit in this context. And finally, on the right-hand side, we see devices deployed and sold to local authorities to allegedly clean up the water. What those devices are actually catching is seaweed and fish. The fish are dead by the time the device is emptied. The quantities of plastic captured are there, but very, very small compared to the biological material that I'd argue we want to leave in the oceans. So it's really clear that we need to make sure that anything we consider as a solution is properly tested. So then, how do we move forward? The risk to me in terms of business in plastics is actually business as usual. What we need to do is to move to smarter, safer, more sustainable products. It's really important that we phase out any use that's non-essential. And in this diagram, I'm indicating over on the right-hand side by the red wedge, some of the plastics that you consider are probably non-essential to society. The microbeads in cosmetics that are now banned in the UK and through eco legislation in Europe. I've heard no consumer complain that they can no longer scrub themselves every morning with millions of small pieces of plastic. These were clearly not essential, and it was right to have legislation to prohibit them. You could argue the same in many locations for single-use carrier bags. But it gets harder when we move on to the packaging that's often picked upon, but it does extend the life of food and drink. So there we need to make sure that we're focused on sustainability. The same for the lightweight parts, perhaps in cars and aeroplanes. So we're going to need to develop criteria to make sure that the plastics we use are essential, that they bring an essential use to humanity, be they in agriculture, food systems, or in any other use across different sectors. And for those plastic products that are essential, we need to make sure they're far safer and more sustainable than they are at present. So those criteria will need to be developed to ensure the future. It's really important, though, that we also take a sectoral approach as we're doing this. Clearly, the plastics that might bring essential use in fisheries will be different to those used in agriculture, will be different to those in textiles, transport and food packaging. So we need to take a sectoral approach to simplify this, and we need to take a groupings approach, both for the plastic products, particularly perhaps focusing on single-use products, where we've got some 40% of all the plastic produced, 400 million tons plus of plastic produced every year, and 40% of it going into plastic packaging, which brings very short convenience to society, but very long persistence as waste. There, the criteria around essentiality, safety, and sustainability may be different to users in transport, for example. So we need these new standards. We also need to support those standards, and critically, we need to support innovation by forward-looking businesses in safer and more sustainable plastics. So we need standards accompanied by appropriate testing and certification. Current standards, such as those from the ISO, are market-driven. They do not ensure the environment and our food systems are protected from the harm that we're currently seeing from plastics. So we will need new standards to be developed and clear labeling, basically so that safer and more sustainable plastics can be recognized in trade, can be recognized in international borders, can be recognized by our farmers and our fishers. I do believe that the plastic treaty currently under negotiation, whilst we're struggling to reach consensus, does provide a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, even a once-in-a-planet opportunity, to mandate these measures for development of criteria around essentiality, safety and sustainability. If I look to the FAO objectives of zero hunger, no poverty, and sustainable use of natural resources, I would argue that to ensure food security for both current and future generations, the FAO actually has a duty of care to ensure the use of plastics across the agri-food system is both safe and sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Thompson. Thank you for this overview of decades of research into microplastic pollution, their effect on the environment, and for already highlighting some of the possible policy pollutions. We mentioned bans, producing plastics more sustainably, focusing on essential plastics, but also standards labeling. So thank you very much for that. Next, we will hear about FAO's latest report on the impacts of plastic pollution, particularly on soil health and crops. Please welcome Dr. Luca Nizzetto, Chief Scientist at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, NIVA, who is the lead author of the report, and he will present the main findings of the report.
Research together with, thank you, a team of scientists of the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, together with a team of scientists and officials from FAO has developed. This is a report that was published early this year and titled State of Research on the Impacts of Plastic Pollution on Soil Health and Crops. Why agricultural plastic? Thank you very much, Richard, for introducing the broader perspective of plastic pollution. Plastic is increasingly an essential asset for agricultural production. There is about 10 million tons that are used in crop and livestock production in terrestrial agriculture, 2 million tons of plastic every year used in fisheries and aquaculture, 200,000 tons yearly in forestry. As you can see, terrestrial agriculture is the biggest user of plastic in this context of food production. About 40% of this material are actually films, plastic films, like the one you see in this picture, greenhouse covers, mulching films, high bales, wrap, etc. It has to be highlighted, however, that the use of plastic in agriculture is not the sole source of pollution in soil system. We are talking here about the broader perspective that brings in also the One Health perspective. So everything is connected, and food system are powerful links and nodes in social and ecological, in human nature interaction, let's say. So beyond agricultural plastic, other agricultural practices are recognized as important source of micro plastic to soil. These are, for example, the use of sewage sludge from a wastewater treatment as a soil amending agent, the use of contaminated compost, for example, from food waste, or digestates, for example, from the production of biogas that are then used as fertilizer in agriculture, but also irrigation with wastewater or contaminated surface water, and finally atmospheric deposition. It is now known that micro and nanoplastic move through the atmosphere and they deposit on land and landscape and waterscape. It is now known that these atmospheric deposition are a bigger source than previously recognized. So this makes the effort of protecting food system from plastic pollution even more complex than just tackling agricultural practices. So the specific objective of this report was actually to review the state of research by looking at all available evidence on the occurrence, impacts, and consequences of microplastic on soil and crop health. How did we do this? This study was based on a systematic literature review that covered the period between January 2014 and April 2024. That was basically at that time the full decades of activity in this area of plastic pollution and terrestrial ecosystem. We use mainstream scientific literature search engine like Web of Science. We only included primary research paper. We didn't look at review papers that actually represent a substantial fraction of all the available literature in this field. They were not directly considered. And yes, we focus on paper that address effect of plastic and microplastic, especially on soil health and crop. And we did not include all the body of literature that focus on the benefit of plastic materials, such as mulching film in improving agricultural productivity. This is another context. So in total, we collected more than 2,000 documents, and about 500 of them match our inclusion criteria. Here on the table, you have all the search strings with the scores of how many papers were retrieved for each topic. Notably, about more than 80% of all the paper we collect during the decades that was covered by this study, more than 80% were produced after 2022. So this tells that there is an exponential increase in the research effort. Of course, after we published the report, after we finalized the report, there has been several months in which the scientific community internationally has been very active. I have to say already now that all evidence that came afterwards basically reinforced what this report highlighted. Yes, so let's go through one by one the question that we ask ourselves. So the first question was, is the use of agricultural plastic in terrestrial agriculture an important source of pollution? So several studies indicated that they, yes, represent an important source. Soil can host variable concentration of plastic, some of them up to 0.3% of the soil mass. I'm talking about the surface soil layer. Main sources were pointed out to be mulching films, residues, fragments from greenhouses, but also more sophisticated applications such as coated fertilizer or coated seeds. Of course, we were looking into a meta-analysis across research from many different groups from all over the world, which imply there is a poor the study were not conducted under strict standard. They were not homogeneous in the method, so there was also some inconsistency in the report, and therefore the data across different studies was poorly comparable. Nevertheless, the general message that we highlighted in this report was clear. So this works highlights that there are high level of plastic in soil. And here at the bottom of this slide, I show some images from filter that we collected extracting plastic from soil in a recent studies. These are European soil that highlight how soil that were treated with mulching film contain high level of mulching film residues on the left-hand side. Field treated with compost contains plastic typically found in wastewater treatment effluents or sewage sludge, and also there is a considerable contribution from atmospheric deposition. This on the right side is the plastic and the material extracted from soil that never received compost, never received sewage sludge, it was not treated with agricultural plastic. So this to remark that the problem is more complex than just looking into the practice used in agriculture. Yes, the second question, is plastic pollution a real concern for soil health? What does this exposure of soils to plastic means, really? So we analyzed about 200 studies that address these questions. Among them, 189 reported at least one significant effect of plastics on some soil properties. These were all studies based on laboratory, mesocosm, and in some cases also field studies. Only 5 studies reported no significant effect. We can further break down this picture. So about 2/3 of all these roughly 200 studies address tested effects at concentration equal or above 0.05% of plastic in soil, well within the environmental exposure range. While about 1/3, less than 1/3, 33 address also concentration below 0.05% in soil. In this case, we have, of course, the majority of studies highlighted the presence of effect, both when they were analyzed below this threshold, concentration threshold, meaning the soil properties are sensitive to this stressor. In fact, what the studies reported were altered physical, chemical, and biological property of soils, effects that occurred at low level, and they also were effects that were independent from the typology of plastic, the shape. Different studies tested effect using different materials. So what change can plastic cause in soil chemical and physical properties? We review this, and I had to say that most of these studies based on empirical assessment of effects focus on residues from mulching film, like the one shows in the slides. They highlighted, most of them highlighted effect on soil microbial community composition and functioning, especially regarding effects on the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is a crucial macronutrient of soil that, at the base of food system. We also typically observe reports of chemical, physical, and hydraulic properties alteration, so the very physics of soil, nutrient budget, carbon budget, and greenhouse gases emission, but also availability of toxins like heavy metals or pesticides. Next question we addressed was, can soil plastic pollution affect plant health and crop production? This is a very fundamental question. We identified at that time 114 studies. as you can see from the slide, we also divide in study that address impacts above this threshold of 0.05% of plastic in soil, again, well within the environmental range, and study that address effects at lower concentration. And all of them basically reported significant effect, but only basically 3 studies. What type of effect were these? So some laboratory-based studies or mesocosm-based studies reported effects on plant growth, nutrient budgets in plant tissues, reduced chlorophyll concentration. Chlorophyll is the molecule at the very base of plant metabolism. Alter nutritional balance, for example, shifts from sugar to protein content. Increased concentration of stress metabolites in plant tissues. Increased bioavailability of toxins. Those effects on growth, for example, were mainly observed in laboratory settings, while in field experiment, a change, an increase of stress response in plant was typically observed without necessarily result in reduced growth in plant. So there was physiological responses, and those impacts could emerge already at very low concentration, down to 0.001% of plastic in soil. So our current level of plastic observed in soil safely below effect threshold? I already answered to this question. Unfortunately not. We have evidence that concentration measured in agricultural soil overlap with the levels capable of affecting soil health and crop health. So this overlap is visible in the range between 0.001% and 0.1% of plastic in soil, which means that agricultural soil appears to be already in the risk zone regarding adverse effect, calling for action. The next question was, can plastic debris and their associated chemicals be transferred to crop? So we know plastic is a complex material. In its formulation, it contains several substances, including harmful substances of relevance for food safety. So up to April 2024, we found 33 useful studies addressing this question, and nearly all of them reported evidence of uptake of plastics and chemical through the root path, essentially, at that stage. And they also show that this small microplastic or nanoplastic and chemicals can move within the plant tissue and reach edible parts. Among the most commonly studied substances at the stage, we had substances that are recognized as endocrine disruptors, for example, bisphenol A is an example, or other priority substances like brominated flame retardant, PFAS, etc. So this raises concern for food safety. And finally, are biodegradable plastics safer alternatives? There is an increased use of plastic materials in agriculture that are based on polymers that can degrade in soil environment. This has been presented to farmers as environmentally safer solution, but that argument we found was not strictly substantiated by scientific evidence. So in fact, what we found that 33 studies up to April 2024 were addressing this question. And they found that debris from partially degraded biodegradable plastic produce similar effect as their conventional microplastics. Those effects can emerge already at 0.02% of plastic in soil, which is a totally expectable concentration in soil that are treated with this type of materials. The risk comes from incomplete degradation, the fact that in some environment this material may not degrade promptly, completely, and also because they contain and during the degradation release their chemical additives. This image is a picture of those fragments from a biodegradable mulching film based on PBAT, obtained in our laboratory using electron microscopy. As you can see, they retain the shape of a film with a very flat shape. So, when it's about thinking what would be the future of biodegradable plastic in agriculture, there is a call here for precautionary approach and long-term studies addressing thoroughly the risk that they pose. In conclusion, we ran this important systematic review, which was very useful to frame the problem. I believe that this provided a clear picture that has been useful for the development, for the rationale behind the development of FAO, a voluntary code of conduct on the sustainable use of plastic in agriculture. We nevertheless highlight knowledge gaps, so there is obviously insufficient data to produce a complete risk assessment. When I say complete risk assessment, is the type of risk assessment that is done in regulatory context. There's not yet a policy that requires that for plastic use in agriculture. However, as I said, there is strong evidence of harm for the environment, soil environment, and crop. Concentration in soil range between 0.001 or less up to 0.3%, making plastic pollution the single most abundant anthropogenic substance in soils. So something that needs to be addressed by policy. It is a problem of global nature. There is an escalating use of plastic in terrestrial agriculture all over the world. And this problem causes some concern for food safety, the transfer of plastic and chemical to food. So it needs to be addressed under the One Health perspective. So we call for a precautionary principle and policy action. Yes, and finally, I just want to thank all my co-authors, Rachel Hurley, Franz Collard, Richard Hughes-Thompson, and Julia Karkashi for contributing to this work, Lev Narrating for conceiving, mobilizing this activity, all the FAO production teams, and of course the reviewers, Dave Fouhy, Marie-Frank Dignac, Richard Thompson, and Joe Yates. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope this was a useful contribution.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Nisetto and also Professor Thompson, for your scientific presentation to all of us. And it really shares a lot of information that you have done during the past years, and also for this report is very important, because we know that now we have the scientific evidence, we have science, but the next step as well, how to link science to the policies, to make sure in terms of the science and policy interface will help us to communicate with policy makers and also to communicate with general public in the simple language that they understand, that we can raise awareness with all of them, and also to ensure that the communication from FAO to the public as well, what the key message that we can convey to wider audience, to make sure that, okay, number one, the use of plastic or sustainable use and management of plastic in agriculture, it improves the productivities. But anyway, we also need to make sure that the use of plastic can have an impact or negative impact to environment, to crop, to animals, aquatic animals, terrestrial animals, and also to our environment at the same time. And that's why we also need to address that we have solution. We have solution, and that solution can be practical, implementable, actionable at the ground level, and to make sure that we address all issues around this using the One Health approach, to make sure that we can highlight that these kind of complex issues about plastic in agriculture, we can use the One Health approach, bring all stakeholders, use the multidisciplinary approach, cross-sectional approach to address these issues in the way that we can bring solution and have a better solution for everyone. Thank you again for your presentation, and I'm sure that many audience who join in this room and also virtually, they also would like to have your PowerPoint presentation. It's fantastic. Even though I already talk with uh, Professor Thompson previously. Could you please share your presentation? I will do the same for Professor Nisetto as well, because your presentation is really, really fantastic, and I really like it. It's very easy to understand a lot of photo, because one photo, it really explains, and especially the link, interlink around this issue is very, very interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you again for your great presentation. Thank you very much. What is next?
So we would now have a few questions from the audience. I think we still have a couple of minutes left. So is there any questions from the room? Yes, I see a hand, and I think the mic is coming.
Thank you for the presentations. They were amazing. I have a question for Luca. Do you have an idea how much we are accumulating in the soils every year? I mean, what is the accumulation rate and what is the removal rate? Because I think maybe we're just growing and growing the amount of plastics in the soils. And if so, do we know how much the increase in microplastics will lead to an increase or to a decrease on productivity? So I'm suggesting something like we do with climate change, right? If we increase 1 degree Celsius, we have these impacts. Can we put that to numbers? Like if we increase 1%, we'll have these impacts. Maybe if we have something like this, we can help frame this for policymakers as well.
Thank you very much. It is a very important question indeed, and it's a difficult one to address. About the accumulation rate, there are some evidence of growing levels of plastic in soil. Those evidence derive from repeated measurements, or let's say measurement of soil with the repeated application of sewage sludge. Sewage sludge is notorious source, so a few reports shows that soils that have received more application of sewage sludge has higher concentration, which is an evidence of a trend, increasing trend. We know that sewage sludge obviously is not the single source. There is a big interplay and complex interplay of processes. And we have not yet addressed the problem of looking in archived soil and try to rebuild the history. This is partly due to the objective, difficult analytical effort. So measuring plastic in soil is very difficult. It's like really looking for the little things in a big complex matrix. But I believe this type of evidence will come in future. We could make a sort of modeling assessment of the trend, which could be biased because we have a limited knowledge about the clearance process, how easily soil can release plastic. And that release could either be due to runoff, so mobilization towards a water system, or deeper soil layers, or even groundwater, which is not good things. There are modeling assessments that show the soil tend to retain most of the plastic that they receive. So I would say, based on the evidence we have today, we could expect that plastic in soil will increase in time, not just because the sources are constant, the sources are increasing. For example, agricultural plastic use is due to increase by 5% every year globally. So we are moving towards bigger inputs. Circularity in the use of sewage sludge is probably also on the trajectory of increasing. So unfortunately, I cannot prospect very positive scenarios for the future of soil and food systems. I guess I addressed your question. There was maybe a third component.
Yes, and I forgot to ask one thing, but maybe to you or maybe to the other researchers here. Do you know if there's an experimental field where we know the amount of microplastics now and we're doing a follow-up and maybe even measuring the leachates or the deep soil migration? Because it would be good to have like a halftime for the
Totally
for
agree.
the soils. Do you know if this is happening somewhere?
There are a few projects that address field studies that both address impact on crops, but also accumulation and fate of plastic. I was coordinator of one of these, and here we have in the room also scientists that has been developed similar studies. So we also have recently finalized first pan-European monitoring of microplastic in soil. So there are about 70 locations in Europe with a measured, accurately measured concentration in soil that could be reanalyzed in future. But of course, these are all slow processes. To look for temporal trend, you need a multiple year of research and constant support from research funding institution to allow you to continue on that direction. And I agree those are important questions because we need to scan the future, the horizon for the future impact and the future sustainability of plastic in soil.
Luca, can I just to add, because there's two parts of your question that are really quite important, but I think are potentially beyond where the science can go. You are asking about a kind of threshold, and you are also asking about a half-life. Let's not forget that we're dealing with thousands of different polymer permutations that vary in size across orders of magnitude, that are having effects across a wide range of species and a wide range of functions, and that the plastics can also contain some 16,000 different chemicals. This isn't like we're dealing with a single heavy metal. It isn't going to be possible to produce a single figure above which it is safe and below which it is not. And we would be fooling ourselves if we wanted to invest in trying to do so. And it's the same with the half-life. We're talking about some plastic products that have an accelerated rate of degradation, but are still failing to degrade at a rate that is sufficiently meaningfully fast to be removed from the soil in line with the rate of application. So I think we can't hope that there are these golden figures out there, and rather, I would argue, than trying to chase them down, which I think will be impossible, we need to take a hazard-based approach, and we need to absolutely minimize all of the potential sources and escape pathways to the environment, because we've got the substantial body of evidence around harm. So I wouldn't try, whilst I'd love to have those thresholds, you're going to need hundreds and hundreds of them. And so I don't think it's a practical question, although I understand why you're asking it. Thank you.
I have one question. I observed in your presentation, you mentioned that some degradable plastic products may not have a complete degradation. It means there are some, if the qualities of the degradable plastic product is not really have a high quality, it can still have a leftovers after the degradation process. Is correct?
Yes, that's correct, and is one of the topics that is under the focus of research right now, an important one. In terrestrial agriculture, these materials are becoming increasingly common, presented as a safer, environmentally greener alternative. The standard, the requirement for their use is quite loose. They can be, in Europe at least, be used, be commercialized, placed on market if they comply with the standard that simply require they will degrade under laboratory condition. In reality, we know very well that there's no such a thing as laboratory condition in the real environment. And I live and work in Norway, where for most of the year the soil temperature is below zero, where virtually no degradation occurs, which means that degradation may take place in multiple years compared to 2 years required by the technical standard. So this is certainly an issue in a context where this mulching film, for example, are used multiple times every year. So the rate of addition is much higher than the rate of degradation. And this is a concern. Also, there is this lateral transport towards aquatic ecosystem. Yeah. Maybe, Richard, you want to say more? You presented some slide.
Well, okay, so there's 2 points here. One is also back to the half-life, because let's not forget that the material in the agricultural soils, some of it is migrating out, but it doesn't mean it's disappeared from the environment in total. The second point is, and it's to your standards, and it's a point I touched on, that the standards aren't really fit for purpose for degradation in the open environment. And that's why, I mean, you know, this isn't a discussion about stopping using plastics. Plastics can bring benefits, but we need to make sure those plastics are safe and sustainable. And we need, therefore, appropriate standards to ensure that that is delivered, and that safety and sustainability cannot be delivered by the current standards using laboratory approaches, because the biodegradation you're talking about, let's not forget, is a system property. It depends on the materials, but also the environment and the temperature. So we're going to need new standards. It's not that those materials don't have a place at all. They potentially do, but the only way we can properly be sure that they're safe is to have appropriate standards that would consider their fate across a whole range of different circumstances and temperatures.
I think we have another question before we have a coffee break.
Yes, I wanted to answer to the lady. We have installed in the Minagris project, which was a sister project of Papillon, a long field experiment in Netherlands, Greece, and France. We will see over some years how these microplastics we added to the soils, how they will degrade, and we put their biodegradable plastics and non-biodegradable plastics into the soils. So just an answer to this, there's a field study. The other issue where I really agree with the both speakers is the biodegradable plastic was sold as the solution for the problem of contamination of soils and the whole environment with agroplastics. What we see in experiments as well in field experiments, biodegradable plastics tend to form millions of microplastics because they are meant to degrade to smaller pieces until they are completely disappearing. In this process, they are transported with wind erosion to the whole surrounding. And then that means people are exposed who are living nearby by inhalation, and they are deposited then on tree leaves, on vegetation, but they can go to a long distance transport and be deposited, and be one reason of the aerial atmospheric deposition we detect in different agricultural fields. So these biodegradable plastics as a solution, it was meant to be a very good idea, but beside the effect that they often do not degrade in soils as it is proposed to be. And don't forget these atmospheric transport, which can lead to a long distance transport.
Yep, next please.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank you, both of you, for this very nice and inspiring conferences. So my question is for Richard. Do you think that there is a direct link between fishing nets and the possible decline of fish stock, wild stocks? This is probably very difficult to establish, but I'm asking this question because something could be behind at least the kind of plastic used in fishing nets and fishing gear in general.
Well, I mean, I think the main thing that's leading to a decline in fish stocks is overfishing and destructive fishing practices rather than the types of nets that are used at the moment. However, it is clear, particularly from lost and discarded fishing nets, that there is substantial bycatch, catch that is dying of commercially important species that never reaches the table and is threatening fish populations and fish stocks. And I mean, in that regard, if we were able to develop and certify biodegradable materials that would be sufficiently durable and long-lasting to be used by the fishers, but that would, if lost at sea, perhaps decompose in such a way that they would no longer be able to catch fish, that could bring an advantage. But to your question, I think that the plastic ingestion, which is clearly occurring by species in the marine environment, whilst it's clearly not a good thing, and we're seeing harmful effects in laboratory studies, I don't think it's the major reason that we're seeing year-on-year decline in fisheries stocks. I think there are other areas where we should focus our attention there on the way we catch the fish and eliminating the loss of gear to the environment as well.
Thank you. I think I'll use this occasion to take another question from online participants, thanking them very much again for joining today. So I have a question on alternative materials for plastic mulching specifically that may be more sustainable. So it could be biodegradable, bio-based, but also just like organic materials. And another question, I'll throw both of them now, about the fact that a number of studies have shown some publications on microplastics have shown that the occurrence of microplastics have been overestimated. Is that like an issue that is still occurring? Has this occurred in the past, but not in recent experiments? Thank you.
May I reply about the first question? I leave the second one to you. Yes, of course, agriculture can and should rely on a broad portfolio of practices. Simplifying for the sake of efficiency has a trade-off with resilience. For example, if we base all our food production on a simple technology based, for example, on plastic film, this could improve in the short-term efficiency in production, maybe also crop reliability, but the day in which we will have problem in having the supply of those material, we will have hard time to ensure food production by going back to more traditional way of doing farming. So I'm talking now as an expert, not in relation to the work I've done for FAO. I would say that policy should always encourage diversity in agricultural practices, and this brings in all traditional knowledge about how to make mulch. Mulch is a technology that has been around for centuries, if not probably millennia. Now we learn how to do with plastic. I can predict that we will not do with plastic forever, for the simple reason that plastic is not a renewable material. So better if we do not forget how to do farming without plastic. This is a little bit of a long-term perspective, but predictions show that in the next 2 to 3 decades, we will have to cope with an increasing price of the raw material to make plastic. Now plastic is so much common in agriculture because it's cheap. So we do not have to wait that there's no any more oil to produce plastic. It's enough that that raw material become expensive enough to seriously undermine food system. So this is a call to policymaker. Let's focus on resilience, not only on efficiency. And resilience means diversity, means going back to traditional knowledge, needs to give voice to those that are able to farm soil, and they have been doing for centuries. They can adopt plastic culture right now, but should not put all their eggs in one basket. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we reached the end of this session for today.
Richard wanted to answer the second question, I think.
I'm so sorry, Richard. You go right ahead.
Only if there's time. The question was about contamination, I think, and were some of the estimates of microplastics overestimates. It's really important, of course, that when you're studying something microscopic that is all around us and is in the air we breathe, that you've got proper laboratory and analytical approaches to ensure that anything you're counting has originated from the environment that you took the sample in and not arisen from the laboratory. I mean, increasingly across the scientific field, we see ever-growing rigor and the use of controls to make sure that there isn't contamination in the lab, the use of clean rooms. So I feel, I can't say I'm confident about every study that's ever been published, but I'm confident about the vast majority of those studies. And secondly, I would say that there may be noise there. There is always the possibility for contamination, but let's also forget that there's error in the opposite direction, that our ability to actually identify very small microplastics is really challenging. Anything less than about 10 microns will exist, but it's really, really hard to identify. Until a few years ago, because of the analytical approaches needed to confirm the presence of tire wear particles in samples, I remember asking an audience of over 200 scientists that work in the field who had found a tire wear particle, and only one hand went up. And that's not because, it was because the analytical approach that was needed was different to the conventional approaches. Now we've got different approaches. We're seeing that tire wear particles are one of the major sources of microplastics. So my point is that there may well be some error. I think that scientists are doing their best to eliminate that error. It's not something that I think is of concern to the data. And let's not forget that any error there is occurring in both directions. And my strong suspicion is that actually we're underestimating the true quantities because we're unable to detect some types of plastic and we're unable to detect the really small pieces, which most, particularly in the nano range, which most scientists would believe are out there and are out there in considerable quantities. So it's not something I would consider a major concern, whilst it's something we need to make sure we do our best to address in any analytical study. But I'm more concerned about what we haven't found than what we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. And I'm afraid we need to close the session now, as we're already running a little bit late. But for those in the room, I encourage you to stay so you can ask perhaps your questions during the coffee break. So thank you again for participating, both the people in the room and to our online participants. Thank you to our speakers for today.